The River, Chapter 2 of Shardik by Richard Adams, read by Celeste Lawrenson in September 2020. The River. The enormous bear wandered irresolutely on through the forest, now stopping to glare about at its unknown surroundings, now breaking once more into a shambling trot as it found itself still pursued by the hiss and stench of burning creepers and the approach of the fire. It was sullen with fear and bewilderment. Since nightfall of the previous day it had been driven, always reluctant, yet always unable to find any escape from danger. Never before had it been forced to flight. For years past no living creature had stood against it. Now, with a kind of angry shame, it slunk on and on, stumbling over half-seen roots, tormented with thirst, and desperate for a chance to turn and fight against this flickering enemy that nothing could dismay. Once it stood its ground at the far end of a patch of marsh, deceived by what seemed a faltering at last in the enemy's advance, and fled just in time to save itself from being encircled as the fire ran forward on either side. Once, in a kind of madness, it rushed back on its tracks and actually struck and beat at the flames until its pads were scorched and black, singed streaks showed along its pelt. Yet still it paused and paced about, looking for an opportunity to fight, and, as often as it turned and went on, slashed the tree trunks and tore up the bushes with heavy blows of its claws. Slower and slower it went, panting now, tongue protruding and eyes half shut against the smoke that followed closer and closer. It struck one scorched foot against a sharpened boulder, fell, and rolled on its side, and when it got up it became confused, made a half-turn, and began to wander up and down, parallel to the line of the oncoming flames. It was exhausted and had lost the sense of direction. Choking in the enveloping smoke, it could no longer tell even from which side the fire was coming. The nearest flames caught a dry tangle of quinine roots and raced along them, licking across one forepaw. Then from all sides there sounded a roaring, as though at last the enemy were coming to grips. But louder still rose the frenzied, angry roaring of the bear itself, as it at last turned to fight. Swinging its head from side to side and dealing tremendous spark-showering blows upon the blaze around it, it reared up to its full height, trampling back and forth until the soft earth was flattened under its feet, and it seemed to be actually sinking into the ground beneath its own weight. A long flame crackled up the thick pelt, and in a moment the creature blazed, all covered with fire, rocking and nodding in a grotesque and horrible rhythm. In its rage and pain it had staggered to the edge of a steep bank. Swaying forward, it suddenly saw below, in a lurid flash, another bear, shimmering and grimacing, raising burning paws toward itself. Then it plunged forward and was gone. A moment later there rose the sound of a heavy splash and a hissing, quenching after-surge of deep water. In one place and another along the bank the fire checked, diminished, and died, until only the patches of thicker scrub were left burning or smoldering in isolation. Through the miles of dry forest the fire had burned its way to the northern shore of the Telferna River, and now, at last, it could burn no further. Struggling for a foothold, but finding none, the bear rose to the surface. The dazzling light was gone, and it found itself in shadow, the shadow of the steep bank and the foliage above, which arched over, forming a long tunnel down the river's marge. The bear splashed and rolled against the bank, but could get no purchase, partly for the steepness and the crumbling of the soft earth under its claws, and partly for the current which continually dislodged it and carried it further downstream. Then, as it clutched and panted, the canopy above began to fill with the jumping light of the fire as it caught the last branches, the roof of the tunnel. Sparks, burning fragments, and cinders dropped hissing into the river. Assailed by this dreadful rain, the bear thrust itself away from the bank and began to swim clumsily out from under the burning trees towards the open water. The sun had begun to set and was shining straight down the river, tinging to a dull red the clouds of smoke that rolled over the surface. Blackened tree trunks were floating down, heavy as battering rams, driving their way through the lesser flotsam, the clotted masses of ash and floating creeper. Everywhere was plunging, grinding, and the thump and check of heavy masses striking one another. Out into this foggy chaos swam the bear, laboring, submerging, choking, heaving up again and struggling across and down the stream. A log struck its side with a blow that would have stove in the ribs of a horse, and it turned and brought both forepaws down upon it, half clutching in desperation, half striking in anger. The log dipped under the weight and then rolled over, entangling the bear in a still smouldering branch that came slowly down like a hand with fingers. Below the surface, something unseen caught its hind paws, and the log drifted away as it kicked downwards and broke free. It fought for breath, swallowing water, ashy foam, and swirling leaves. Dead animals were sweeping by, a striped macchiati with bared teeth and closed eyes, a Terrian floating belly uppermost, an ant-eater whose long tail washed to and fro in the current. The bear had formed some cloudy purpose of swimming to the further shore, a far-off glimpse of trees visible across the water. But in the bubbling, tumbling midstream, this, like all else, was swept away, and once more it became, as in the forest, a creature merely driven on in fear of its life. Time passed, and its efforts grew weaker. Fatigue, hunger, the shock of its burns, the weight of its thick, sodden pelt, and the continual buffeting of the driftwood were at last breaking it down, as the weather wears out mountains. Night was falling, and the smoke clouds were dispersing from the miles of lonely, turbid water. At first the bear's great back had risen clear above the surface, and it had looked about it as it swam. Now only its head protruded, the neck bent sharply backwards to lift the muzzle high enough to breathe. It was drifting, almost unconscious, and unaware of anything around it. It did not see the dark line of land looming out of the twilight ahead. The current parted, sweeping strongly away in one direction and more gently in the other. The bear's hind feet touched ground, but it made no response, only drifting and tipping forward like a derelict, until at length it came to rest against a tall, narrow rock sticking out of the water, and this it embraced clumsily, grotesquely, as an insect might grasp a stick. Here it remained for a long time in the darkness, upright like some tilted monolith, until at last, slowly relaxing its hold and slipping down upon all fours in the water, it splashed through the shallows, stumbled into the forest beyond, and sank unconscious among the dry, fibrous roots of a grove of queen trees.